Chapter 26, Part II of Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 26. The Wars of Italy. Charles VIII. 1483 to 1498, Part II. When the States General had separated, Anne de Beaujeu, without difficulty or uproar, resumed, as she had assumed on her father's death, the government of France, and she kept it yet for 7 years, from 1484 to 1491. During all this time she had a rival and foe in Louis, Duke of Orleans, who was one day to be Louis XII. "I have heard tell," says Brantome, "how that, at the first, she showed affection towards him, nay, even love, in such sort that, if Monsieur d'Orleans had been minded to give heed thereto, he might have done well, as I know from a good source; but he could not bring himself to it, especially as he found her too ambitious, and he would that she should be dependent on him, as premier prince and nearest to the throne, and not he on her; whereas she desired the contrary, for she was minded to have the high place and rule everything. They used to have," adds Brantome, "prickings of jealousy, love, and ambition." If Brantome's anecdote is true, as one is inclined to believe, though several historians have cast doubts upon it, Anne de Beaujeu had, in their prickings of jealousy, love, and ambition, a great advantage over Louis of Orleans. They were both young, and exactly of the same age; but Louis had all the defects of youth, whilst Anne had all the qualities of mature age. He was handsome, volatile, inconsiderate, impudent, brave, and of a generous, open nature, combined with kindliness; she was thoughtful, judicious, persistent, and probably a little cold and hard, such, in fact, as she must needs have become in the school of her father, Louis XI. As soon as the struggle between them began, the diversity of their characters appeared and bore fruit. The Duke of Orleans plunged into all sorts of intrigues and ventures against the fair regent, exciting civil war, and, when he was too much compromised or too hard pressed, withdrawing to the court of Francis II., Duke of Brittany, an unruly vassal of the King of France. Louis of Orleans even made alliance, at need, with foreign princes, Henry VII., King of England, Ferdinand the Catholic, King of Aragon, and Maximilian, Archduke of Austria, without much regard for the interests of his own kingly house and his own country. Anne, on the contrary, in possession of official and legal authority, wielded it and guarded it with prudence and moderation in the interests of France and of the crown, never taking the initiative in war, but having the wit to foresee, maintain, and, after victory, end it. She encountered from time to time, at her own court and in her own immediate circle, a serious difficulty: the young king, Charles, was charmed by the Duke of Orleans' brilliant qualities, especially by the skill and bravery that Louis displayed at tournaments. One day, interrupting the Bishop of Montauban, George of Amboise, who was reading the breviary to him, "Send word to the Duke of Orleans," said the king, "to go on with his enterprise, and that I would fain be with him." Another day he said to Count Dunois, "Take me away, uncle; I am longing to be out of this company." Dunois and George of Amboise, both of them partisans of the Duke of Orleans, carefully encouraged the king in sentiments so favorable to the fair regent's rival. Incidents of another sort occurred to still further embarrass the position for Anne de Beaujeu. The eldest daughter of Francis II., Duke of Brittany, herself also named Anne, would inherit his duchy, and on this ground she was ardently wooed by many competitors. She was born in 1477, and at 4 years of age, in 1481, she had been promised in marriage to Edward, Prince of Wales, son of Edward IV., King of England. But 2 years afterwards, in 1483, this young prince was murdered, or, according to other accounts, imprisoned by his uncle Richard III., who seized the crown, and the Breton promise vanished with him. The number of claimants to the hand of Anne of Brittany increased rapidly, and the policy of the duke her father consisted, it was said, in making for himself 5 or 6 sons in law by means of one daughter. Towards the end of 1484, the Duke of Orleans, having embroiled himself with Anne de Beaujeu, sought refuge in Brittany, and many historians have said that he not only at that time aspired to the hand of Anne of Brittany, but that he paid her assiduous court, and obtained from her her marks of tender interest. Count Darn, in his Histoire de Bretagne, p. 82, has put the falsehood of this assertion beyond a doubt. The Breton princess was then only 7, and the Duke of Orleans had been 8 years married to Joan of France, younger daughter of Louis XI. But in succeeding years and amidst the continual alternations of war and negotiation between the King of France and the Duke of Brittany, Anne de Beaujeu and the Duke of Orleans, competition and strife between the various claimants to the hand of Anne of Brittany became very active. Alan, Sire d'Aubray, called the Great because of his reputation for being the richest lord of the realm, Viscount James de Rohan, and Archduke Maximilian of Austria, all three believed themselves to have hopes of success, and prosecuted them assiduously. Sire d'Aubray, a widower and the father of 8 children already, was 45, with a pimply face, a hard eye, a hoarse voice, and a quarrelsome and gloomy temper; and Anne, being pressed to answer his suit, finally declared that she would turn nun rather than marry him. James de Rohan, in spite of his powerful backers at the court of Rennes, was likewise dismissed; his father, Viscount John II., was in the service of the King of France. Archduke Maximilian remained the only claimant with any pretensions. He was 29, of gigantic stature, justly renowned for valor and ability in war, and of more literary culture than any of the princes his contemporaries, a trait he had in common with Princess Anne, whose education had been very carefully attended to. She showed herself to be favorably disposed towards him; and the Duke of Orleans, whose name, married though he was still sometimes associated with that of the Breton princess, formally declared, on the 26th of January, 1486, that when he came to the Duke of Brittany's, it was solely to visit him and advise him on certain points touching the defence of his duchy, and not to talk to him of marriage with the princesses his daughters. But whilst the negotiation was thus inclining towards the Austrian prince, Anne de Beaujeu, ever far sighted and energetic, was vigorously pushing on the war against the Duke of Brittany and his allies. She had found in Louis de la Tremoille an able and a bold warrior, whom Guicciardini calls the greatest captain in the world. In July, 1488, he came suddenly down upon Brittany, took one after the other the Chateaubriand, Ancenis, and Fougeres, and on the 28th gained St. Aubin de Cormier, near Rennes, over the army of the Duke of Brittany and his English, German, and Gascon allies, a victory which decided the campaign; 6,000 of the Breton army were killed, and Duke Louis of Orleans, the Prince of Orange, and several French lords, his friends, were made prisoners. On receiving at Angers the news of his victory, Charles VIII. Gave orders that the 2 captive princes should be brought to him; but Anne de Beaujeu, fearing some ebullition on his part of a too prompt and too gratuitous generosity, caused delay in their arrival; and the Duke of Orleans, who was taken first to the castle of Sable and then to Lusignan, went ultimately to the Tower of Bourges, where he was to await the king's decision. It was a great success for Anne de Beaujeu. She had beaten her united foes, and the most formidable of them all, the Duke of Orleans, was her prisoner. 2 incidents that supervened, one a little before and the other a little after the battle of St. Aubin du Cormier, occurred to both embarrass the position and at the same time call forth all the energy of Anne. Her brother in law, Duke John of Bourbon, the head of his house, died on the 1st of April, 1488, leaving to his younger brother Peter his title and domains. Having thus become Duchess of Bourbon, and being well content with this elevation in rank and fortune, Madame the Great, as Anne de Beaujeu was properly called, was somewhat less eagerly occupied with the business of the realm, was less constant at the king's council, and went occasionally with her husband to stay a while in their own territories. Charles VIII., moreover, having nearly arrived at man's estate, made more frequent manifestations of his own personal will; and Anne, clear sighted and discreet though ambitious, was little by little changing her dominion into influence. But some weeks after the battle of St. Aubin du Cormier, on the 7th or 9th of September, 1488, the death of Francis II., Duke of Brittany, rendered the active intervention of the Duchess of Bourbon natural and necessary; for he left his daughter, the Princess Anne, barely 18 years old, exposed to all the difficulties attendant upon the government of her inheritance, and to all the intrigues of the claimants to her hand. In the summer of 1489, Charles VIII. And his advisers learned that the Count of Nassau, having arrived in Brittany with the proxy of Archduke Maximilian, had by a mock ceremony espoused the Breton princess in his master's name. This strange mode of celebration could not give the marriage a real and indissoluble character; but the concern in the court of France was profound. In Brittany there was no mystery any longer made about the young duchess's engagement. She already took the title of Queen of the Romans. Charles VIII. Loudly protested against this pretended marriage; and to give still more weight to his protest he sent Henry VII., King of England, who was much mixed up with the affairs of Brittany, ambassadors charged to explain to him the right which France had to oppose the marriage of the young duchess with Archduke Maximilian, at the same time taking care not to give occasion for thinking that Charles had any views on his own account in that quarter. "The king my master," said the ambassador, "doth propose to assert by arms his plain rights over the kingdom of Naples, now occupied by some usurper or other, a bastard of the house of Aragon. He doth consider, moreover, the conquest of Naples only as a bridge thrown down before him to take into Greece. There he is resolved to lavish his blood and his treasure, though he should have to pawn his crown and drain his kingdom, for to overthrow the tyranny of the Ottomans, and open to himself in this way the kingdom of heaven." The King of England gave a somewhat ironical reply to this chivalrous address, merely asking whether the King of France would consent not to dispose of the heiress of Brittany's hand, save on the condition of not marrying her himself. The ambassadors shuffled out of the question by saying that their master was so far from any such idea that it had not been foreseen in their instructions. Whether it had or had not been foreseen and meditated upon, so soon as the reunion of Brittany with France by the marriage of the young duchess, Anne, with King Charles VIII. Appeared on the horizon as a possible, and peradventure probable fact, it became the common desire, aim, and labor of all the French politicians who up to that time had been opposed, persecuted, and proscribed. Since the battle of St. Aubin du Cormier, Duke Louis of Orleans had been a prisoner in the Tower of Bourges, and so strictly guarded that he was confined at night in an iron cage, like Cardinal Ballou's, for fear he should escape. In vain had his wife, Joan of France, an unhappy and virtuous princess, ugly and deformed, who had never been able to gain her husband's affections, implored her all powerful sister, Anne of Bourbon, to set him at liberty. "As I am incessantly thinking," she wrote to her, "about my husband's release, I have conceived the idea of setting down in writing the fashion in which peace might be had, and my said husband be released. I am writing it out for the king, and you will see it all. I pray you, sister, to look to it that I may get a few words in answer. It has been a very sad thing for me that I never see you now." There is no trace of any answer from Anne to her sister. Charles VIII. Had a heart more easily touched. When Joan, in mourning, came and threw herself at his feet, saying, "Brother, my husband is dragging on his life in prison, and I am in such trouble that I know not what I ought to say in his defence. If he has had aught wherewith to reproach himself, I am the only one whom he has outraged. Pardon him, brother; you will never have so happy a chance of being generous." "You shall have him, sister," said Charles, kissing her. "Grant Heaven that you may not repent one day of that which you are doing for him to day." Some days after this interview, in May, 1491, Charles, without saying anything about it to the duchess, Anne of Bourbon, set off one evening from Plessis du Pare on pretence of going a hunting, and on reaching Berry sent for the Duke of Orleans from the Tower of Bourges. Louis, in raptures at breathing the air of freedom, at the farthest glimpse he caught of the king, leapt down from his horse and knelt, weeping, on the ground. "Charles," says the chronicler, "sprang upon his neck, and knew not what cheer (reception) to give him, to make it understood that he was acting of his own motion and free will." Charles ill understood his sister Anne, and could scarcely make her out. But two convictions had found their way into that straightforward and steady mind of hers: one, that a favorable time had arrived for uniting Brittany with France and must be seized; the other, that the period of her personal dominion was over, and that all she had to do was to get herself well established in her new position. She wrote to the king her brother to warn him against the accusations and wicked rumors of which she might possibly be the object. He replied to her on the 21st of June, 1491, "My good sister, my dear, Louis de Pasquin has informed me that you have knowledge that certain matters have been reported to me against you, Whereupon I answered him that naught of the kind had been reported to me; and I assure you that none would dare so speak to me; for, in whatsoever fashion it might, I would not put faith therein, as I hope to tell you when we are together. Bidding you adieu, my good sister, my dear." After having reassured his sister, Charles set about reconciling her, as well as her husband, the Duke of Bourbon, with her brother in law, the Duke of Orleans. Louis, who was of a frank and by no means rancorous disposition, as he himself said and proved at a later period, submitted with a good grace; and on the 14th of September, 1491, at La Fleche, the princes jointly made oath, by their baptism and with their hands on the book of the Gospels, to hold one another once more in perpetual affection, and to forget all old rancor, hatred, and ill will, for to well and loyally serve King Charles, guard his person and authority, and help him to comfort the people, and set in order his household and his kingdom. Councillors and servants were included in this reconciliation of the masters; and Philip de Commynes and the Bishop of Montauban, ere long Archbishop of Rouen, governor of Normandy, and Cardinal d'Amboise, went out of disgrace, took their places again in the king's councils, set themselves loyally to the work of accomplishing that union between Charles VIII. And Anne of Brittany whereby France was to achieve the pacific conquest of Brittany. Pacific as it was, this conquest cost some pains, and gave some trouble. In person Charles VIII. Was far from charming; he was short and badly built; he had an enormous head, great blank looking eyes, an aquiline nose, bigger and thicker than was becoming, thick lips, too, and everlastingly open, nervous twitchings, disagreeable to see, and slow speech. "In my judgment," says the ambassador from Venice, Zachary Contarini, who had come to Paris in May, 1492, "I should hold that, body and mind, he is not worth much. However, they all sing his praises in Paris as a right lusty gallant at playing of tennis, and at hunting, and at jousting, exercises to the which, in season and out of season, he doth devote a great deal of time." The same ambassador says of Anne of Brittany, who had been for 4 months Queen of France, "The queen is short also, thin, lame of one foot, and perceptibly so, though she does what she can for herself by means of boots with high heels; a brunette, and very pretty in the face, and, for her age, very knowing; in such sort, that what she has once taken into her head she will obtain somehow or other, whether it be smiles or tears that be needed for it." Knowing as she was, Anne was at the same time proud and headstrong; she had a cultivated mind; she was fond of the arts, of poetry, and of ancient literature; she knew Latin, and even a little Greek; and having been united, though by proxy and at a distance, to a prince whom she had never seen, but whom she knew to be tall, well made, and a friend to the sciences, she revolted at the idea of giving him up for a prince without beauty, and to such an extent without education, that, it is said, Charles VIII., when he ascended the throne, was unable to read. When he was spoken of to the young princess, "I am engaged in the bonds of matrimony to Archduke Maximilian," said Anne, "and the King of France, on his side, is affianced to the Princess Marguerite of Austria; we are not free, either of us." She went so far as to say that she would set out and go and join Maximilian. Her advisers, who had nearly all of them become advocates of the French marriage, did their best to combat this obstinacy on the part of their princess, and they proposed to her other marriages. Anne answered, "I will marry none but a king or a king's son." Whilst the question was thus being disputed at the little court of Rennes, the army of Charles VIII. Was pressing the city more closely every day. Parleys took place between the leaders of the two hosts, and the Duke of Orleans made his way into Rennes, had an interview with the Duchess Anne, and succeeded in shaking her in her refusal of any French marriage. "Many maintain," says Count Philip de Segur, "that Charles VIII. Himself entered alone and without escort into the town he was besieging, had a conversation with the young duchess, and left to her the decision of their common fate, declaring to her that she was free and he her captive, that all roads would be open to her to go to England or to Germany, and that for himself he would go to Touraine to await the decision whereon depended, together with the happiness of his own future, that of all the kingdom." Whatever may be the truth about these chivalrous traditions, there was concluded on the 15th of September, 1491, a treaty whereby the two parties submitted themselves for an examination of all questions that concerned them to 24 commissioners, taken half and half from the two hosts; and, in order to give the preconcerted resolution an appearance of mutual liberty, authority was given to the young Duchess Anne to go, if she pleased, and join Maximilian in Germany. Charles VIII., accompanied by 100 men at arms and 50 archers of his guard, again entered Rennes, and 3 days afterwards the King of France and the Duchess of Brittany were secretly affianced in the chapel of Notre Dame. The Duke of Orleans, the Duchess of Bourbon, the Prince of Orange, Count Dunois, and some Breton lords, were the sole witnesses of the ceremony. Next day Charles VIII. Left Rennes and repaired to the castle of Langeais in Touraine. There the Duchess Anne joined him a fortnight afterwards. The young Princess Marguerite of Austria, who had for 8 years been under guardianship and education at Amboise as the future wife of the King of France, was removed from France and taken back to Flanders to her father, Archduke Maximilian, with all the external honors that could alleviate such an insult. On the 13th of December, 1491, the contract of marriage between Charles VIII. And Anne of Brittany was drawn up in the great hall of the castle of Langeais, in 2 drafts, one in French and the other in Breton. The Bishop of Albi celebrated the nuptial ceremony. By that deed, if my Lady Anne were to die before King Charles, and his children, issue of their marriage, she ceded and transferred irrevocably to him and his successors, kings of France, all her rights to the duchy of Brittany. King Charles ceded in like manner to my Lady Anne his rights to the possession of the said duchy, if he were to die before her without children born of their marriage. My Lady Anne could not, in case of widowhood, contract a second marriage save with the future king, if it were his pleasure and were possible, or with other near and presumptive future successor to the throne, who should be bound to make the king regnant, on account of the said duchy, the same acknowledgments that the predecessors of the said Lady Anne had made. On the 7th of February, 1492, Anne was crowned at St. Denis, and next day, the 8th of February, she made her entry in state into Paris, amidst the joyful and earnest acclamations of the public. A sensible and a legitimate joy, for the reunion of Brittany to France was the consolidation of the peace which, in this same century, on the 17th of September, 1453, had put an end to the 100 Years' War between France and England, and was the greatest act that remained to be accomplished to ensure the definitive victory and the territorial constitution of French nationality. End of Chapter 26, Part 2.